We are going to be looking at the story of Noah and the flood in Genesis. The story really starts in chapter 6, runs through chapter 9, and we're going to be referencing it as we go. But we're going to be reading this morning from chapter 9, starting at verse 8. After Noah has come out of the ark, has sacrificed to God, God is in the process then of declaring this covenant to him. And then God said to Noah and to his sons with him, I now establish my covenant with you and with your descendants after you, and with every living creature that was with you, the birds, the livestock, and all the wild animals, all those that came out of the ark with you, every living creature on earth. I establish my covenant with you. Never again will all life be cut off by the waters of a flood. Never again will there be a flood to destroy the earth. And God said, This is the sign of the covenant I am making between me and you and every living creature with you, a covenant for all generations to come. I have set my rainbow in the clouds, and it will be the sign of the covenant between me and the earth. Whenever I bring clouds over the earth and the rainbow appears in the clouds, I will remember my covenant between me and you and all living creatures of every kind. Never again will the waters become a flood to destroy all life. Whenever the rainbow appears in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and all living creatures of every kind on the earth. So God said to Noah, This is the sign of the covenant I have established between me and all life on earth. Now, last week, we were back in Genesis again, and we were looking at a number of chapters 4 and 5, and we were tracing the generations from Adam through Cain and through Seth. And we were seeing that there are two different lines of generations of people and two very different kinds of people who came out of that. And you see that particularly, as we said, in Lamech and Enoch, the seventh generation from Adam in each of the two lines. Lamech, of course, in Cain's line, who represents the fullness of the godless man. Enoch in Seth's line, who represents the fullness of those who call upon the Lord. Now, we paused there, but Genesis 5 goes on through Seth's line a number of more generations until it comes to Noah. And then you'll go into chapter 6 and the beginnings of the story of the flood. And that's what we're going to be talking about this morning then, is what came after that, with Noah then in the line of Seth, a righteous man, and the world that he lived in and what God purposed to do there. And I want to set the stage for this then by looking at the picture of where the world was at that time from God's point of view. He had made human beings to be the crown of his good creation. He had made human beings in his own likeness, so that human beings, you and I, were like him in some way, bore his resemblance. He provided the human race, people, with everything that they needed. He put them in charge of everything. He gave them the keys to the planet, so to speak. It was theirs to run, theirs to manage, theirs to live in, theirs to enjoy. And what do? Right away, with Adam and Eve, they reject God for a lie that casts doubt on his goodness. They are determined to go their own way. A drive for independence that is in the human race. Independence from God. To throw off the shackles, if you will, though they had never been chained. To be free from God, to do it their way, though He had never enslaved them. And now, generations later, God sees in chapter 6 how great their wickedness has become, because wickedness has a tendency to multiply. It's what we saw with Lamech, that through the 7 generations, the seed that is there in Canaan comes to fullness there. And so in chapter 6, God saw how great man's wickedness on the earth had become. That's verse 8. And that every inclination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil all the time. And what was God's reaction? The Lord was grieved that He had made man on the earth, and His heart was filled with pain. God was grieved and He was full of pain, because it's like a father or a mother who watches a child of theirs walk away from them, walk down wrong paths, deliberately choose evil and wrongdoing. That's the position God is in as He watches the people He made in His own image to be crown of creation walk away from Him. That drive for independence that is there, the pride and the arrogance and the wickedness that begins to rise up. So what does He do? Because that's there then. And even with these 2 lines, you have them probably intermarrying and a wickedness that comes to a full flowering. And God really has 2 choices. He can wipe them out because of what He sees and the grief and the pain that it causes Him, and the fact that it's not the way it's supposed to be. Or He can somehow seek to restore what was destroyed in the fall and everything that has gone wrong. Which on the face of it doesn't look that easy, maybe not even possible. That is the context then of Noah's generation that he finds himself living in, and where God decides then that He will destroy all mankind, verse 7 of chapter 6. So the Lord said, I will wipe mankind whom I have created from the face of the earth, men and animals and creatures that move along the ground, and birds of the air, for I am grieved that I have made them. And notice that it is every living creature. It extends beyond human beings to every living creature He has made. He determines to send a flood to destroy all living things. But notice something else in the verse immediately following that, when He says that He's going to wipe out human beings and living creatures, but Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. And in the next verse, this is the account of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time, and he walked with God. And it sounds like Enoch, an ancestor of his. He's in that line, the line of Seth, one who calls upon the name of the Lord. And he found favor with the Lord. And so in the midst of this wickedness and of people turning away from Him, God finds someone who follows Him. There is a remnant, you see. There is always a remnant. There is a remnant at every time when God brings judgment in different ways. There was a remnant in Israel many, many years later. And there is a remnant now in the earth that pursues God and calls upon His name. There was a remnant in the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah when God determines to destroy them. And it's Abraham's tactic, as you recall, is to appeal to God on the basis of that remnant, on the basis of, well, what if there are some righteous people in there? There's always a remnant who belong to God and whose call on His name, and God cannot bring Himself to destroy them. And so even as he's saying that he will wipe out the human race, he is deciding that he won't. And he has Noah then build an ark and collect these animals. And what he's doing is he is creating an ark then, a sanctuary that will be salvation for them in the midst of the flood. And so even as God determines to judge and to destroy, he makes plans to restore. And I think we see something of God's heart in that. So the flood comes. God releases all of that primeval power of chaos. You may remember in the creation that it was the waters that were there on the face of the earth. That's the primeval chaos and destructiveness that's there. And he has separated it, put some of it below the earth and some of it above the earth. And now what he does is he opens the windows of heaven so that it just floods out, and he opens the springs below the earth so that it comes from below. And all of that destruction and chaos and everything that we fear comes true and comes up. And all living creatures are destroyed. And chapter 7 says that the waters flooded the earth for 150 days. And then we have another one of those fascinating comments that crop up in this story. Chapter 8, verse 1. But God remembered Noah. I love that. Here you have the waters on the face of the earth. Everything's destroyed. There's an ark floating on it. Somewhere it's like a chip on the waves. And God remembers Noah. Now you got to think this through. When God remembers something like that, it's not like you and I when we're going through a day and all of a sudden it's like, oh, that's right. I forgot. I remember now. No. When God remembers something, when Scripture says that God remembers, it means that he remembers with purpose. It means that he's been keeping his eye on things and that now it's time to step in and do something. And so he does. God remembers Noah in the midst of the flood and in the midst of the chaos. He remembers you and me too, as we find ourselves in the flood of life by times as well, floating like a chip out there somewhere. And he begins to do something. He sends the waters back to where they belong. He dries up the land. Everything goes back again to the way that it was supposed to be. The dry land emerges. It's almost like creation again. Noah emerges from the ark. The animals come back out, ready to repopulate the earth so that living life can go on. And the first thing that Noah does is to worship God. In chapter 8, verse 20, Noah built an altar to the Lord, and taking some of all the clean animals and clean birds, he sacrificed burnt offerings on it. And he could do that because he had 7 of each of those. He had some extras for that, so that he could make that sacrifice. And then what happens then is God smells that. The Lord smelled the pleasing aroma and said in his heart, "Never again will I curse the ground because of man, even though every inclination of his heart is evil from childhood. And never again will I destroy all living creatures as I have done. As long as the earth endures, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night will never cease." He smells that, and his heart is moved, and he makes a determination that he will not send a flood like that again. He will not destroy like that again, even though every inclination of his heart is evil from childhood. Because you see, even though Noah is the survivor with his family, and even though he is described as a righteous man who walked with God, he has in him something that all of us do ever since Adam and Eve, and that is there's a thread of sin there. We carry that in us. We're born with it. We live with it. Noah would too. And so what will happen is what is described in chapter 6. It'll happen again. The wickedness of human beings will flourish, will come to fullness. There will be those who call upon the Lord, but there will be those who do not, who pursue their own ways. And as that wickedness comes to flourish once again, God is saying, even though that happens, even though you have these terrible things that happen that should lead me to wipe you out, I won't. I won't do that. Instead, he's saying we can count on the cycles of life continuing. We can count on the fact that even though in this broken world there are terrible forces of nature by times, and there are hurricanes and tornadoes and earthquakes and floods and things like that, they are localized. God is not wiping out the human race. Life would be incredibly terrifying without that promise. Because every time something terrible happened, you'd wonder, is this the end? Will it ever stop? It means with God's promise there that we can live with a fundamental kind of security in this world, that we in the world are still held in God's hands, that even with these disruptions, that the cycles of life will go on despite everything, that there will be seed time and harvest, there will be fall and winter and summer and spring, there will be day and night. It will go on. And it's comforting to us in times of difficulty along the way, when it seems like the flood is wiping everything out. That brings us then to chapter 9 and to the passage that we read, to the covenant that God made. It's a covenant with Noah, with all of his descendants, and with all living creatures. A covenant is a promise that is made, a binding promise, and sealed with certain things that are done to seal it, with sacrifices and so forth. And it can be done between nations or between kings, and it is done in Scriptures between God and His people. And this is the first covenant that God has made, but it's not the last one that He makes with His people. And it's a binding promise then. God binds Himself in this covenant to hold Himself by His word to what He has said. He will remember it as long as earth exists. And there's that remembering again. Just as Noah was out on the flood there, God remembered Noah and stepped in because it was time to dry the place out and to restore. God will remember. And a sign of His promise is the rainbow. And again, God says a fascinating thing about that. He says, I have set my rainbow in the clouds, and it will be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. Whenever I bring clouds over the earth and the rainbow appears in the clouds, I will remember my covenant. And he goes on a little further. Whenever the rainbow appears in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant that I have made. Now again, does that mean that it's like God is tying a string around His fingers so that He will remember? Because otherwise He might forget. So that He sees the rainbow and it's like, yeah, that's right, I remember now. Kind of the way that I will turn my watch around or take it off to remember something, to prod my memory. No, that's not how God works. God is putting that there for you and for me, and He is saying that whenever He sees it, He will remember His promise, so that whenever we see it, we will remember that He remembers. Whenever we see the rainbow, we are reminded that God sees it too. That God is reminding Himself of His promise, that He remembers now and that He always will remember the promise that He has made. It's for us. It's for our insecurities. When we're afraid that God forgets. Have you had those kinds of times? I think most of us have, probably all of us at some time or other, when the flood is rushing in, and when we don't know what we can count on, and we feel like we're being overwhelmed. And it can be true individually in our lives, it can be true collectively, it can be true because of some disaster that takes place that affects a whole nation or a whole region. It can be, as with a hurricane, it can be true simply in our own lives when the flood comes rushing in and chaos is there, and we wonder, does God remember me? Does He know where I am? Or has He forgotten about me? And what the rainbow says is that God remembers. He always remembers. And He always will remember. And it says something more to us. This story here and the way that it plays out, the fact that even as God looks at that evil that is flourishing like crazy and says, I will wipe it out, already in the working out of that, what do we see? We see Him rescuing and restoring. We see His salvation at work with Noah, his family, and all the living creatures. We see the ark as a sanctuary provided for their salvation. We see God's heart for restoration. And in His covenant that He makes to never do that again, we see God's heart for restoration rather than for destruction. That is God. That is your God and my God. A God whose heart is not to destroy, not that people should perish, but that people should be rescued and saved. Does that mean that all are? No, because we walk our own way, because there is in the human race this thread in us, this sin in us, this drive in us, all of us, away from God, to our own independence, in our own pride, and in our own arrogance. Search your own heart on that and see if you don't find it there. Look around you and see if you don't see it in the world. Look at your children and see if it's something that you have to teach them or if it's something that they just somehow do. Yes, there's a lot of goodness in man, in men and women. But there's this too, and it will always come to flowering. And in the midst of that, God's heart is for restoration, for the remnant that is there, for His people among them that He is drawing to Himself. That's in that covenant. That's in the story of the flood. And after the flood, you see, there's one more story that will lay the foundations for understanding the world that we live in. That's the Tower of Babel. And then immediately after that comes the story of Abram, who God picks and chooses and makes a covenant with, changes his name to Abraham, and sets in motion what He intends to do in order to bring about that restoration of the earth and its people that His heart longs for. In that story, the great story of redemption is launched, which we see here in this covenant. God choosing Abram to become Abraham, making a covenant with him, making him to be the father of the people of Israel. He makes a covenant at Mount Sinai with the people of Israel that He will be their God and He gives them His law, and they will be His people. He makes a covenant with Phinehas, who is one of the priests there and who is zealous for God when after the golden calf and things like that have taken place. He is zealous for God, and he makes a covenant with Phinehas of a priesthood that will last forever. And then he makes a covenant with David of a kingdom that will never fail and a royal line that will always rule. And then he makes a new covenant in the New Testament when he brings all of that about in Jesus Christ. It's based on Jesus and what he did for us. When he makes the sacrifice for you and for me and for all mankind, for all who call upon his name, all who are part of that line of Seth, who call upon the name of the Lord, they shall be saved. Jesus, who is also in that line of Seth through Noah, He is the blessing to all the nations promised to Abraham. He is the fulfillment of the law given at Mount Sinai. He is the priest who intercedes for us forever beside the throne to his Father, as Phinehas was. He is the king, like David, who rules forever, who God, his Father, has given all authority in heaven and upon earth. And he makes us to be then children of God as we turn to him. And he puts his Spirit into us. And the New Testament tells us that in that new covenant, we become a new creation. And that stuff that comes from Noah and comes before that from Adam and Eve, and it continues to run through the human race and runs through you and me, is now on the way out. So that we can become and begin to become the kind of people that God wants us to be. Not in this life, but as we go through the process of sanctification, yes, we will grow towards Jesus. And when he renews the new heavens and the new earth, and we are part of that, we shall be transformed with it. And we shall be the people that he has intended, and the creation shall be the creation that he has intended, because that is the heart of God. His heart is not to destroy, but his heart is to restore. And to work then within the creation and through what we read in the Bible, the great story of redemption. And it's all there in that covenant that God makes with Noah. It's all there in that rainbow when we see it. God remembers the promise he has made. God remembers his love for the people who call upon his name. God remembers his love for the creation that he has made, broken as it is, sinful as it is. He remembers his love for you and for me, even as we turn away from him, and he calls us toward himself to call upon his name. And that's all there, rather than the other choice, to destroy. He reminds us then of his love for us. He reminds us of his heart for restoration. He reminds us of who he is, and we need that. We need that because we live in a world with floods and earthquakes and hurricanes and tornadoes and tsunamis and forest fires. Literally, but also figuratively in our lives, we live with destruction that takes place as well. And we need to know the promise of a God who cares, who remembers, who sends a Redeemer to meet us in the midst of our flood so that we are not destroyed and the earth is not destroyed because of his love and his heart for restoration. There is a Redeemer, Jesus, God's own Son, precious Lamb of God, Messiah, Holy One. Thank you, O my Father, for giving us your Son and leaving your Spirit till the work on earth is done.
Messiah.